Vamos a tener con nosotros precisamente a uno de los economistas del Banco Mundial, es Carlos Arteta, es lead economist in the prospects group of the World Bank. Carlos, thank you so much for having us a few minutes.
Thank you very much.
Carlos, World Bank has already updated its World Economic Outlook, a downward review compared to the January report. This new report includes the impact of the war in Ukraine, but also other factors of uncertainty as inflation and the persistence of supply problems. World Bank lowers 2022 global growth forecast to 2.9% versus 4.1 forecast in January. It's a significant impact.
Indeed, it is. 6 months ago, as you mentioned, we were expecting a substantial deceleration in the world economy, as well as high inflation. Now we see that the deceleration is going to be even sharper, and inflation is going to be even higher, reminiscent to the stagflation period we lived in the 1970s. And in that sense, the spillovers from Russia's invasion in Ukraine is set to sharply hasten this acceleration. The invasion is leading to high commodity prices, is leading to supply disruption, is increasing food insecurity and poverty. It exacerbates inflation, and it contributes to tighter financial conditions. So all of this is going to lead to a much more challenging context for the world economy as well as for developing economies.
Indeed, it is a challenging context, Carlos, and stagflation risk rises amid sharp slowdown in growth. Which similarities and differences do you see between this future stagflation compared to the 17th one?
There are a number of similarities that are worrisome relative to the 1970s. In the 70s, we saw persistent supply side disruptions, in particular in oil prices, which fuel inflation substantially. We also saw a protracted period of highly accommodative monetary policy in advanced economies. We also saw prospects of weakening growth and also vulnerabilities in many developing countries that culminated in a series of the crises in the early 80s. However, it's also important to emphasize there are notable differences. For instance, the percentage increase in commodity prices are now smaller. Balance sheets of major financial institutions are generally stronger. And more importantly, and unlike the 1970s, central banks in advanced economies and in many developing economies now have clear mandates for price stability. So these institutional improvements would hopefully attenuate these similarities and will hopefully avoid a period of stagflation in the near term.
And a faster than expected tightening of financial conditions could push some countries into the type of debt crisis in the 80s, according to David Malpass, World Bank's president. Which could be the main consequences and the magnitude of this crisis?
It will depend on the underlying vulnerability of specific countries. However, something that will be common to all countries is the fact that monetary policy is going to be tightened and tightened substantially at a much faster pace than we expected 6 months ago in order to counter these inflation pressures. It will indeed depend on the external position of particular economies. It will also depend on bank balance sheets. It will depend on the reaction of central banks in the affected economies to this faster tightening of monetary condition. And in that sense, the risk is going to vary across economies and across continents. But what is important is to emphasize that there are policy actions that can be taken to mitigate this tightening. Communicating monetary policy decisions clearly, leveraging credible monetary policy frameworks, and protecting central bank independence can effectively anchor inflation expectations and mitigate the need for a tightening of financing condition, and thus reduce the amount of policy tightening required to achieve the desired effects on inflation and activity.
And Carlos, you mentioned the financial stability mandate of the Federal Reserve. We are observing how supply chain disruptions and the risk of stagflation are hammering growth, economic growth. And one of the main questions now is if the Fed will be able to avoid undermining the economy.
Well, our baseline projections call for a substantial but orderly tightening of monetary policy and of financing conditions at the global level. That being said, of course, we also explore scenarios of downside risks affecting the global economy. One of the scenarios we explored was related to even faster tightening of financing conditions in the United States. And what we saw is that this would, of course, have an impact on the United States, but more importantly, even faster than expected tightening would be substantial disruptions, will lead to substantial disruptions in monetary and financing conditions for many developing countries due to the substantial increase in borrowing costs. There are, of course, other risks, and in our Larsen scenario, we explored a multitude of risks materializing at once, a perfect storm, if you will. And if we layer a potential faster tightening of the Fed, in addition to additional energy disruptions, particularly in Europe, and additional lockdowns in China, you could have a substantially lower pace of growth. This year could be 2.5%, and next year 2.1%, and next year could be even as low as 1.5%, which would be really close to a global recession.
And Carlos, of course, we are observing the evolution of inflation, high prices in not only in the US or Europe, but also in every country in the world. Global inflation now is expected to moderate next year, but it will likely remain above inflation targets in many economies. The report of the World Bank notes that if inflation remains high, a repeat of the resolution of the earlier stagflation episode could translate into a sharp global downturn along with financial crises in some emerging markets and development economies. Which could be the impact of this?
Well, it would be a substantial impact. As you mentioned, right now, inflation is exceeding targets in almost all countries that have inflation targets. Inflation is at multi-decade highs in many economies, advanced economies and emerging markets alike. So there will be a need for monetary tightening. The question is, of course, how much it will be, what the degree of this tightening will be, how much this tightening can be calibrated in order to, on the one hand, ensure price stability, but on the other hand, also continue nurturing this very fragile recovery from the pandemic. So in that sense, it will once again depend on the individual circumstances of specific countries, but there is a notable risk that a much faster tightening of financing conditions in the context of really high debt levels in many economies could have substantial pressures in many economies, both low-income countries as well as middle-income countries, with really adverse effects on growth, on per capita incomes, and on poverty alleviation.
Carlos Arteta, thank you so much for having us a few minutes to do a more detailed analysis about your report, this this revision about the prospects of economic growth. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.